The room smelled like antiseptic and warm plastic, the kind of smell that sticks to the back of your throat and reminds you you're not leaving anytime soon. The monitor beside my bed beeped in a slow, stubborn rhythm. Every breath pulled at the stitches along my side, and my ribs felt like they were held together by glass and hope. I had just learned how to sit up without blacking out when the door flew open. My father didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't look at the IV in my arm or the bandage taped across my chest. He stood at the foot of my bed, jaw tight, eyes hard, and said it like he'd rehearsed it on the drive over. Pay rent or get out. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. I waited for the follow-up, a joke, a question, anything that sounded like concern. Nothing came. I looked at him, then at the pale green walls, then back at his face. "I'm in the hospital," I said. My voice surprised me. It was calm, clear. "I can't even stand on my own." "That's not my problem," he snapped. "You don't get special treatment." Something settled in my chest then, heavier than the pain. I shook my head. "No," I said. "Not like this." His hand came out of nowhere. The sound cracked through the room before the pain did. I felt myself fall, felt the floor slam into my shoulder, tasted blood in my mouth. For a moment the beeping stopped, or maybe I just couldn't hear it anymore. As I lay there staring at the underside of the bed, one thought cut through everything else. That slap didn't break me. It showed me exactly who he was, and it set something in motion he never saw coming. When I was helped back onto the bed, it wasn't by him. A nurse avoided my eyes as she adjusted the blankets and told everyone to keep things calm. My father stood there, arms crossed, breathing hard as if he were the one who'd been wronged. No one told him to leave. No one asked if I wanted him gone. I was 57 years old, lying in a hospital bed after a bad fall that had left me with cracked ribs and a head injury serious enough to keep me overnight. I had worked my entire adult life. I had paid my bills. I had helped my family more times than I could count. And in that room, with my body still shaking from pain and shock, I realized how little any of that mattered to them. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "The rent was due days ago," he said. "You think being here changes that I didn't answer?" I couldn't. The words tangled somewhere between my chest and my throat. What struck me wasn't just the cruelty of what he was saying. It was the timing, the urgency, the way his eyes kept flicking toward the door like he was racing something invisible. He left without another word. No goodbye, no warning, just the echo of his footsteps fading down the hallway. I lay there long after the room went quiet again, replaying the moment over and over. The slap hurt, yes, but it was the look on his face afterward that stayed with me. Not anger, not even satisfaction. It was something sharper, something anxious. That was the first time I wondered if the money was only an excuse. The rest of my family filtered in later that evening, one by one, as if on a schedule they'd all agreed to. My younger sister hovered near the window, arms folded, staring at the parking lot instead of at me. When I asked if she'd seen what happened, she shrugged and said, "You know how he gets like that?" Explained everything. My father's wife sat in the chair by the bed and adjusted her purse on her lap. She asked the nurse how long I'd be staying and whether the insurance would cover it. She never asked how much pain I was in. When I mentioned the slap, she smiled tightly and said, "Let's not make a big deal out of things." No one contradicted him. No one told him he'd gone too far. It was like the room itself had decided this was normal. The longer they stayed, the clearer it became that they weren't there for me. They were there to make sure I understood the situation. The rules hadn't changed just because I was hurt. If anything, they'd hardened. At one point, my father reappeared in the doorway. He didn't come in. He didn't need to. "You've got a deadline," he said. "Don't forget that." I watched the way my sister nodded, without looking at him, the way his wife gathered her things, already preparing to leave. It felt coordinated, rehearsed, as if this conversation had happened somewhere else before it ever reached me. After they left, the room felt colder. The nurse checked my vitals and asked if I wanted anything for the pain. I told her no. My body hurt, but my mind was too awake for medication. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the word he'd used. Rent. As if I were a tenant. As if the years I'd spent contributing to that house, the repairs I'd paid for the help I'd given when things were tight, had all been erased with a single word. He hadn't asked for money like someone who needed it. He demanded it like someone who was afraid not to get it. That thought stayed with me through the night, through the beeping and the distant sounds of carts rolling down the hallway, through the nurse changing my IV and the dull ache that never quite faded. By morning, I understood something I hadn't been ready to see before. This wasn't about discipline or fairness. It wasn't about teaching me a lesson or reminding me of my place. It was about control. And the way he'd rushed into that hospital room, the way his voice had cracked when I said no, told me that control was slipping. I didn't know what he was hiding yet. I didn't know why he needed me desperate and compliant instead of injured and recovering. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If I stayed quiet and watched instead of fighting back, I might finally see the truth he was so desperate to keep buried. I didn't remember anyone helping me up off the floor. I remembered the cold of the tiles seeping through the thin hospital gown, the way my shoulder burned where it had taken most of the impact, and the strange hollow sound inside my own head, like I was listening to the world from underwater. When I opened my eyes again, I was back on the bed pillows stacked too neatly behind me, the blanket tucked in with clinical precision. My father was gone. A nurse stood near the monitor, pretending to focus on the numbers flashing across the screen. She asked me to rate my pain on a scale from 1 to 10, her voice careful, distant. When I told her I was fine, she nodded too quickly, as if relieved I wasn't asking for anything more. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask if I felt safe. That silence said more than any apology would have. The first family member to come back was my sister Elaine. She slipped into the room like she was afraid of being seen. Her purse clutched tight against her chest. She didn't sit down. She leaned against the wall and stared at the floor. "You okay?" she asked. It wasn't a question that expected an honest answer. It was a formality, something to fill the space before she said what she'd really come to say. "I got slapped onto the floor," I said. "In front of everyone." Elaine winced, but she didn't look at me. "You know how Dad is," she said softly. "He gets worked up." That was it. That was the explanation. Not shock, not anger on my behalf. Just a tired excuse, worn thin from years of use. I watched her carefully then, the way her shoulders stayed tense, the way her eyes flicked to the door every few seconds. She wasn't here to check on me. She was here to make sure I didn't cause trouble. My father's wife, Marlene, arrived next. She breezed in with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, carrying a cup of coffee that smelled rich and sweet. She placed it on the table beside my bed like an offering. "Hospital food is awful," she said brightly. "I told your father I'd bring him something decent." She spoke as if he were the patient, as if I weren't lying there with cracked ribs and a headache that pulsed behind my eyes. Marlene adjusted the blanket around my legs, her movements brisk, efficient. "You really scared us," she added, lowering her voice. "We can't have any more incidents like that." "Incidents," I repeated. She smiled again, tighter this time. "Arguments," she said. "These things get blown out of proportion." I realized then that the slap already had a new name. It had been reduced, smoothed over, turned into a misunderstanding before I'd even had time to process it. That wasn't an accident. That was practice. Elaine shifted uncomfortably. "Dad's under a lot of stress," she said. "You know that." I wanted to ask what kind of stress made a man hit his injured child and demand money from a hospital bed. Instead, I stayed quiet. I let the silence stretch until it made them uneasy. Marlene cleared her throat. "About the rent," she began. There it was, not even an hour later, and we were back to the same subject. The same word, rent. "I'm in the hospital," I said again. "I can barely sit up." "And that's unfortunate," Marlene replied, her tone sympathetic but firm. "But the situation at the house hasn't changed." Elaine nodded as if on cue. "We just don't want things to get worse." Worse. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Worse than being slapped. Worse than being threatened while injured. Worse apparently than being treated like a problem instead of a person. "What happens if I don't pay?" I asked quietly. Neither of them answered right away. They exchanged a look, quick and practiced. It was the same look I'd noticed earlier, the one that had lodged itself in my memory because it didn't belong in a family conversation. "That's not something we need to get into right now," Elaine said finally. Marlene placed her hand on the bed rail, her fingers tapping lightly, nervously. "Let's just focus on you getting better," she said. "Then we'll sort everything out." But her eyes gave her away. There was no plan to sort anything out. There was a plan to keep me compliant. After they left, a distant cousin stopped by then, an aunt I hadn't seen in years. Each visit followed the same pattern. A brief expression of concern, a careful avoidance of the incident itself, and then always a reference to my father's position. "He's done a lot for you. He's old-fashioned. He doesn't mean harm." No one said that was wrong. No one said you didn't deserve that. And no one not once asked me what I wanted. By the end of the afternoon, I felt more exhausted than I had after the fall. Not from pain, but from the weight of being quietly blamed for my own mistreatment. It was like being pressed down under water again and again, taught to accept the lack of air as normal. Late that evening, as the sky outside the window darkened, I heard voices in the hallway, familiar ones. I closed my eyes and listened. "He shouldn't push this," Elaine was saying. "Not now." "We don't have a choice," my father replied. His voice was low, tense. "It has to be done." There was a pause. Then Marlene spoke, her tone sharp with worry. "What if he refuses another pause? Longer this time." "He won't," my father said. "He always caves." My chest tightened, not with hurt, but with recognition. That was how they saw me. Not as family, as leverage. They didn't come in, they didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. When the hallway fell silent again, I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. Everything clicked into place with a clarity that surprised me. The rush, the coordination, the way the conversation kept circling back to money without ever explaining why it mattered so much so suddenly. This wasn't about teaching me responsibility. It wasn't even about the rent. It was about removing me from the equation. If I paid, I stayed quiet and useful. If I didn't, I became a problem they could push out of sight. Either way, they got what they wanted. For the first time since the accident, the pain in my ribs felt manageable. What I couldn't ignore anymore was the deeper ache, the one that came from understanding just how far they were willing to go. I turned my head toward the window, watching the lights of passing cars blur together. Somewhere beyond those walls, life was moving forward, unaware of the small, private war unfolding in that hospital room. They thought I was alone. They thought I was weak. And they thought the worst thing they'd done was slap me to the floor. They had no idea what it felt like to finally see the truth clear and sharp after years of excuses, or how dangerous a person could become once they stopped begging for fairness and started paying attention. As the night settled in, one thought repeated itself, steady and calm. They weren't trying to punish me, they were trying to erase me, and I was done pretending I didn't notice. The morning after they left, I woke before dawn to the soft hum of the hospital waking up around me. A cart rattled down the hallway. Someone laughed too loudly near the nurse's station. My ribs ached in a dull, constant way, but my mind felt sharp, almost painfully so. I replayed every word my father had said in that room. Not the shouting, not the slap, the details, the phrasing, the urgency in his voice when he mentioned the rent, the way he hadn't asked if I could pay, only whether I would. Something about it didn't fit. My father had never been punctual about anything in his life. Bills were suggestions. Deadlines were flexible. He used to joke that the world bent for people who knew how to push. Yet there he was, standing over my hospital bed, acting like a man racing a clock only he could see. I closed my eyes and went through it again, slower this time. He hadn't said, "You're late." He'd said, "It's due," as if someone else were waiting on the other end. When Elaine came back that morning, I was ready for her. She brought a bag of muffins and an expression that tried too hard to look casual. "Dad's worried about you," she said, setting the bag on the table. "He just doesn't show it well." I didn't respond. I watched her hands instead, the way she twisted her ring around her finger, the way she kept glancing at her phone as if expecting it to buzz. "He's under a lot of pressure right now," she added. "There it is," I said. She froze. "There's what pressure," I said. "From who?" Elaine's mouth opened, then closed again. She laughed quick and brittle. "You're reading too much into it." Maybe. But her reaction told me more than her words ever could. If there were nothing to hide, she wouldn't have flinched. Later that afternoon, my father called. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't mention the incident. He went straight to the point, his voice tight and clipped. "You've got 3 days," he said. "I need an answer. An answer to what I asked." "Don't do this," he snapped. "You know what I'm talking about." I did, and I didn't. "What happens in 3 days?" I asked. Silence stretched across the line. I could hear his breathing faster than usual. "That's not your concern," he said finally. That confirmed it. Whatever this was, it had a deadline. And it scared him enough to lose control in a hospital room. After the call ended, I stared at my phone for a long time. My hands were steady. My chest wasn't tight. The fear I'd expected never came. In its place was something colder, more focused. I wasn't the problem. I was the obstacle. That evening, a nurse named Carol came in to check my vitals. She was older with kind eyes and a voice that didn't rush. When she adjusted my IV, she hesitated. "Rough family visit yesterday," she said gently. I met her gaze. "You could say that." She nodded as if filing the moment away. "You'd be surprised how often money shows up in rooms like this," she said. "People think emergencies pause everything. They don't." "Does it usually make people desperate?" I asked. Carol gave a small, sad smile. "Only when there's something bigger at stake." After she left, I lay there staring at the door, my heart beating a little faster now. Bigger at stake. The phrase echoed in my head. The next clue came from Marlene, though she didn't realize she was giving it to me. She called that night, her tone sugary and forced. "We're trying to help you," she said, "but you're making it difficult." How I asked. "By not cooperating," she replied. "This is a sensitive time. For who I pressed." Another pause. Another misstep. For everyone she said too quickly. I almost laughed. Instead I said, "Then tell me what's actually going on." She sighed, the sound heavy with annoyance. "You don't need to know all the details," she said. "You just need to do your part. My part. Like this was a play and I'd forgotten my lines." After we hung up, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The picture was still incomplete, but the shape of it was there. The rent wasn't the goal. Compliance was. Silence was. And my presence, my questions, my refusal to fall in line threatened whatever arrangement they'd made without me. The following day, while waiting for discharge papers, I overheard 2 orderlies talking outside my room. "Guy in billing is freaking out," one of them said. "Some files on hold." Again, the other replied. "That's the 3rd one this week." They moved on before I could hear more, but my mind latched onto the word. Hold. Files. Delays. When Elaine picked me up later that afternoon, she drove too fast and talked too much. She complained about traffic, about work, about how tired she was. She didn't mention home. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed a strange car parked down the street. Dark, clean, unfamiliar. Elaine noticed it too. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Who's that?" I asked casually. "No idea," she said a beat too late. "Probably a neighbor." But she didn't look convinced. Inside the house, everything felt staged, cleaned too thoroughly, papers stacked neatly on the counter that had never been there before. My father wasn't home. Marlene said he was handling something. Handling. Another vague phrase. Another deflection. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed listening. The house creaked and settled around me. Somewhere a phone rang. Somewhere else it stopped abruptly. That night, lying in the dark, I finally allowed myself to say it out loud, even if only in my head. They needed me out of the way. Not because I owed them money, not because I'd done something wrong, but because my presence complicated a plan already in motion. I didn't know yet what that plan was. I didn't know who else was involved or how far it reached, but I understood the role they'd assigned me. I was supposed to be quiet, grateful, and pliable, and when I wasn't, they tried to push me aside as quickly as possible. I stared at the ceiling, the pain in my ribs flaring as I shifted. It didn't matter. Pain was temporary. Understanding was not. If I stayed loud and angry, I'd give them exactly what they expected. A distraction. an excuse. But if I stayed silent and watched, really watched, they would show me everything they were trying so hard to hide. And that was when I made the decision that changed everything. I would stop asking for answers. I would let them reveal themselves. The discharge papers were thinner than I expected. A few pages clipped together a list of instructions, a warning about lifting anything heavier than a grocery bag. The nurse read them out loud while I nodded my mind already elsewhere. I signed where she pointed my name, shaky but legible. Elaine waited by the exit keys in her hand. She didn't offer to carry my bag. She walked ahead of me like she always did, setting the pace without asking if I could keep up. The ride back was quiet. Not the comfortable kind. The kind filled with things neither of us wanted to say. Every bump in the road sent a sharp reminder through my ribs. I bit down and stared out the window, watching familiar streets pass by as if I were seeing them for the last time. When we pulled into the driveway, something felt wrong immediately. The house looked the same, but the air around it didn't. The porch light was on in the middle of the afternoon. The curtains were drawn tight. Elaine cut the engine and sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel. "You should rest," she said. "Just don't start anything today." I didn't ask what she meant. We both knew. Inside the house smelled like cleaning solution. Sharp, sterile, as if someone had tried to erase the past few decades in a single afternoon. My footsteps sounded too loud on the hardwood floors. Elaine disappeared into the kitchen, already busy with something that didn't involve me. I went down the hall toward my room. The door didn't open. I tried again, slower this time, pressing down on the handle, feeling the resistance. A lock I hadn't agreed to, a lock I hadn't been told about. For a moment, I just stood there, my hand still on the knob. My chest felt tight, not from pain, but from the sudden certainty settling in my gut. I knocked once. Nothing. I knocked again, harder. Elaine. She appeared at the end of the hall, her face carefully blank. "What's wrong?" "My door's locked," I said. She hesitated just long enough. "Dad said it would be easier this way." Easier for who, I asked. She didn't answer. She stepped closer and handed me a folded piece of paper. It was a typed note, not even signed. It explained that my room was being reorganized and that I should gather only what I needed for now. It mentioned rent again. It mentioned responsibility. It mentioned timelines. It didn't mention me. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. Elaine looked past me down the hall. "Maybe stay with a friend," she said. "Just until things calm down." Things. Always things. Never actions. Never choices. My father came in through the front door a few minutes later. He took one look at me standing there with the paper in my hand and nodded as if this were exactly how he'd planned it. "I told you," he said, "deadlines matter." "I just got out of the hospital," I replied. "You locked me out of my own room. It's my house," he said flatly. "You're a guest. Guests follow rules." I stared at him, trying to find something familiar in his face. Anything that suggested hesitation or doubt. There was none. He was calm, prepared. This wasn't an impulse. It was execution. "What about my things?" I asked. "You'll get what you need," Marlene said from the kitchen doorway. We packed a bag. She brought it out and set it at my feet. A duffel bag, half empty, a few changes of clothes, no paperwork, no personal items, none of the things that mattered. I bent down slowly, my ribs protesting, and unzipped it. "Where's my laptop?" I asked. "My documents." "Those stay," my father said, "until we settle this." Settle this. As if there were anything left to discuss. "I've lived here for years," I said. "I helped pay for this place. And now you're being difficult," he snapped. "You don't get to rewrite history." The audacity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. I zipped the bag back up and straightened, breathing carefully. "You planned this," I said. "Before the hospital. Before everything." He didn't deny it. That was the most honest thing he'd done all week. "We're done talking," he said. "You can leave now, or you can make this uglier than it needs to be." I looked at Elaine. She stared at the floor. I looked at Marlene. She busied herself with straightening a stack of mail that wasn't crooked. No one was going to stop this. I walked toward the front door, each step deliberate. The house felt smaller with every move, like it was closing in on me, pushing me out. At the threshold, I paused and turned back. "I'll come back for the rest of my things," I said. My father's lips curved into a thin smile. "We'll see." Outside, the air was cool and bright, painfully normal. I stood on the porch for a moment, duffel bag at my feet, unsure where to go. Then I noticed the car parked across the street, the same dark sedan I'd seen earlier, engine running, someone inside watching the house. As I picked up the bag and walked down the steps, the car pulled away slowly, like it had seen enough. I didn't know what that meant yet. I only knew it wasn't a coincidence. I called a friend from the sidewalk and asked if I could crash on her couch for a few days. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask questions. The kindness hit me harder than the slap had. That night, lying on a borrowed couch with my ribs aching and my belongings reduced to a single bag, the reality finally sank in. They hadn't just threatened me, they'd removed me. The locks, the note, the packed bag, it had all been ready. I'd just been inconveniently injured when they decided to move forward. I stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me and replayed my father's words. Guests follow rules. Deadlines matter. He thought he'd stripped me of my leverage, of my place, of my voice. What he didn't realize was that by pushing me out so abruptly, he'd also pushed me into a position where I could see things more clearly than ever before. I wasn't inside the house anymore. I was outside it looking in, and that made all the difference. The couch sagged in the middle, and every time I shifted my ribs reminded me they were still cracked and angry. Morning light leaked through the blinds in thin stripes, cutting across the living room floor. My friend had already left for work, a blanket folded neatly at my feet, and a mug waiting on the table like a small act of mercy. For the first time since the hospital, no one was watching me. No footsteps in the hallway. No voices deciding my fate in the next room. Just silence. It was in that silence that the questions came back sharper than before. Not the emotional ones. The practical ones. Why the rush? Why the locks? Why the deadlines? Why now? I reached into the duffel bag they'd handed me like charity and dumped its contents onto the couch. Clothes, a charger, a pair of shoes. Nothing else. It was exactly what they'd intended me to have. Enough to survive. Not enough to think. As I gathered everything back up my fingers, brushed something stiff at the bottom of the bag. Paper. Folded, thick edges worn. I froze. I hadn't put any papers in there. Slowly, carefully, I pulled it out. An envelope. Plain, unmarked, the flap already open. My heart started to beat a little faster, not with panic, but with recognition. This didn't belong here, which meant someone had made a mistake. Inside was a photocopy of a document. Not the whole thing, just the first few pages. The text was dense formal, the kind of language that made your eyes want to slide off the page. But my name jumped out immediately, not as the owner, as the subject. I sat there, the morning light warming my skin, and read it twice. Then a third time. Dates. Signatures. A reference to authority granted under temporary circumstances. A phrase about incapacity that made my stomach drop. This wasn't about rent. This was about removing me legally. I felt a chill spread through me even as the room warmed. My father hadn't just wanted me out of the house. He'd wanted me documented as a problem, as someone unreliable, someone who couldn't be trusted with his own affairs. And he'd started the process before I ever fell and landed in that hospital bed. I leaned back against the couch, the paper shaking slightly in my hands. Pieces began sliding into place, each one clicking with a sickening sense of inevitability. The pressure, the urgency, the rehearsed concern, the way everyone had spoken around me instead of to me. They weren't improvising, they were executing. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through old messages, old emails, things I'd ignored before because they'd seemed insignificant at the time. A missed appointment that had been rescheduled without my consent. A form I'd been asked to sign just in case. A conversation where my father had insisted on handling something to save me the trouble. I'd trusted him, trusted all of them. The document in my hands wasn't complete, but it didn't need to be. It was proof that something had been set in motion without me. Something that required me to be cooperative, quiet, and preferably out of the way. And then I remembered the look on Marlene's face when she handed me the duffel bag, the tight smile, the way she'd avoided my eyes. She hadn't meant to give me this. Someone had slipped it in by accident, or out of guilt, or because deep down they couldn't live with themselves if I never knew. Either way, it was mine now. I folded the paper back into the envelope and sat there for a long time letting the truth settle. Anger flared briefly, hot and bright, then burned itself out. What replaced it was colder, steadier. Understanding. They hadn't evicted me because I owed money. They'd evicted me because they needed privacy. They needed time. They needed to finish something without me asking questions or getting in the way. The slap, the hospital scene. It hadn't been planned. That had been fear slipping through the cracks. I thought back to the way my father's voice had tightened when I said no, the way he'd repeated the deadline like a mantra. 3 days. He needed me gone fast. I stood up carefully and moved to the small dining table. I spread the document out and took pictures of every page with my phone. Then I emailed them to myself and uploaded them to a cloud account I'd created years ago and forgotten about. I didn't trust anyone else with it yet. I didn't even trust myself not to misplace it. Once it was safe, I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. For years I'd been told I was dramatic, sensitive, difficult, that I read too much into things, that I needed to let my father handle matters because he knew how the world worked. And here it was. The world he'd been working so hard to control. I didn't confront him. I didn't call Elaine or Marlene and demand explanations. That would have been what they expected. A scene, an accusation. Something they could twist into proof of instability. Instead, I did nothing. I went about my day like a man licking his wounds. I thanked my friend for letting me stay. I responded to messages with vague assurances that I was fine. I even sent my father a short text. I need a little time. I'll be in touch. No anger. No resistance. Just compliance. The response came quickly. Good. Let's keep this calm. Calm. That word again. Calm was what you wanted when you were hiding something fragile. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the room filled with shadows, I thought about the person who had slipped that document into my bag. Elaine unlikely. She'd been too afraid. Marlene possible, but she didn't strike me as careless. That left my father. The thought made me laugh softly, then stop. No, not him. Someone else. Someone on the edges. Someone who had access but not authority. A clerk, an assistant, a family friend who'd been told too much and trusted too little. It didn't matter yet. What mattered was that I wasn't blind anymore. I lay back on the couch staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly overhead. The pain in my ribs pulsed steady and manageable. Physical pain I could handle. It was the quiet, long-term kind that did the real damage. They had tried to reduce me to a problem to be solved, a liability to be managed, a signature waiting to happen, and they almost succeeded. If I'd paid the rent, if I'd apologized, if I'd stayed in that house and accepted their terms, I would have signed away pieces of my life without ever realizing it. The document proved that. I thought about my father sitting in his chair, convinced everything was under control, about Marlene organizing papers on the counter, about Elaine nodding along, telling herself it was for the best. They thought I was isolated. They thought I was powerless. They had no idea that by pushing me out so abruptly, they'd handed me the one thing I'd never had before, the truth. I reached over and turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into darkness. Tomorrow I would start paying attention in a way I never had before. Not loudly, not emotionally, quietly. This wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. And the secret they never meant for me to find was only the first crack in the story they'd worked so hard to build. I stopped calling. That was the first rule I set for myself. No checking in, no asking how things were going, no reminding anyone that I still existed. I let my phone sit face down on the coffee table for hours at a time, resisting the urge to fill the silence with explanations they didn't deserve. Silence, I realized, made people nervous when they expected compliance. The first few days after I found the document were the hardest. Every instinct I had told me to confront my father, to demand answers, to shove the proof in his face, and watch him squirm. But I'd spent a lifetime reacting to him, and every reaction had ended the same way. He deflected. He dominated. He rewrote the story until I was the problem again. This time I did nothing. I stayed on my friend's couch and followed the restrictions the doctor had given me. No heavy lifting, no sudden movements, plenty of rest. It gave me the perfect excuse to be quiet and invisible, to observe without being suspected of anything more than sulking. That's when I started to notice patterns. My father began calling at odd hours, early mornings, late nights, never midday, never when someone else might overhear. I didn't answer, but I watched the missed calls stack up, each one closer together than the last. His messages grew shorter, less confident. "Call me. We need to talk. This is getting complicated." Complicated. That word again. Elaine texted once asking if I was settling in. I replied hours later with a vague line about resting and figuring things out. She didn't respond. But later that evening, my father called again. They were coordinating, always had been. I began keeping notes, not dramatic ones, just observations, dates, times, who reached out and when, what they said, what they avoided saying. It felt strange at first, like I was betraying my own family. Then I remembered they'd already done that to me. One afternoon I walked slowly past the old house, not to confront anyone, just to look. From the sidewalk it seemed unchanged, but when I paid attention the differences were obvious. New locks. A camera above the garage that hadn't been there before. The blinds in my old room permanently closed. Someone was worried about being watched. I didn't go closer. I didn't linger. I kept walking like I was just another neighbor out for fresh air. My ribs protested, but I welcomed the pain. It reminded me to move carefully, to stay patient. Later that day, my phone buzzed with a message from Marlene. "Your father is very upset. You're making this harder than it needs to be." I stared at the screen, then set the phone back down without replying. Upset meant he wasn't in control. Upset meant something wasn't going according to plan. That night, I overheard something by accident. I was in the kitchen refilling a glass of water when my friend's phone rang on the counter. She answered it on speaker without realizing I was there. "No, I don't know anything," she said, sounding annoyed. "He's staying with me because he got hurt. That's it." There was a pause. Her jaw tightened. "I'm not getting involved," she said. "Don't call me again." She hung up and noticed me standing there. "That was your sister," she said. "She wanted to know if you'd said anything. Anything at all." I nodded. "Thanks for not answering." She frowned. "What's going on?" "Something that doesn't get better if I talk too much," I said. She studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then don't." That was another thing I noted. Elaine reaching outside the family, fishing for reassurance, for leaks. Pressure was spreading. Over the next few days, my father's routine shifted. I knew because neighbors mentioned it casually. He was leaving early, coming back late, canceling his usual weekly errands. He wasn't sleeping well. It showed in the way his voice cracked when he finally reached me one evening. "I'm trying to help you," he said, irritation barely masking panic. "But you're forcing my hand." I let the silence stretch before replying. "I'm recovering," I said. "That's all." "You need to come home," he snapped. "This limbo isn't good for anyone, not for me." "I'll think about it," I said. The line went dead. That was when I knew the silence was working. The more I withdrew, the more they revealed themselves. Marlene began sending messages framed as concern, but packed with information she didn't realize she was giving away. Deadlines, appointments, references to the paperwork and the people waiting. People. Not family, not friends. People. I stopped deleting messages and started saving them. Screenshots. Backups. I didn't respond, but I read every word carefully, paying attention to what slipped through when they thought they were still in charge. One message mentioned a meeting that had been moved up. Another hinted at a decision that couldn't be delayed any longer. None of it included me. I wasn't meant to be part of it, which made me the loose end. I noticed something else, too. My father stopped threatening me directly. No more talk of rent. No more ultimatums. Instead, there were appeals. Guilt. Nostalgia. Stories about how much he'd done for me. He was shifting tactics. That told me time was running out. One evening, as I sat alone on the couch with the lights off, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail. I didn't listen to it right away. I waited until my breathing was slow, until my hands were steady. His voice sounded tired. "We need to resolve this," he said. "Other people are getting impatient." There it was, the confirmation I'd been waiting for. Other people. I saved the voicemail and added a note to my growing list. External pressure confirmed. From that point on, I became even more careful. I limited my movements. I varied my routine. I made sure no one could predict where I'd be or when. It wasn't paranoia, it was discipline. I thought about confronting him every day, about how easy it would be to end the suspense by laying everything out. But easy was never safe. And safe was no longer the goal. Control was. By staying silent, I'd taken something from him he'd always relied on. My reactions, my explanations, my willingness to smooth things over. Without those, he was exposed. One afternoon, I noticed a small detail that confirmed everything. Elaine posted a photo online from inside the house. In the background, barely visible, was a stack of folders on the dining table. Thick ones, labeled, not with my name. I smiled for the first time in days. They were preparing for something final, something they believed was inevitable, and they believed I was no longer a factor. That night I wrote one last note to myself. They think silence means surrender. They don't know its strategy. I set my phone down, turned off the lamp, and lay there listening to the quiet. My ribs still hurt. My future was still uncertain. But for the first time since the hospital, I wasn't afraid. Time had shifted. And now it was working for me. I didn't plan to tell anyone. That had been my rule from the beginning. Silence was safer. Silence kept things clean. But the longer I watched my father unravel, the clearer it became that knowing the truth and surviving it were two different things. The call came from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. "This is Daniel Ross," the voice said when I answered. "We met years ago. You probably don't remember me." I did the moment he said his name. Daniel had handled a small legal matter for our family more than a decade earlier. Nothing dramatic, just paperwork, just signatures. My father had dismissed him afterward as overly cautious, which should have been a warning all by itself. "You left me a message," Daniel continued. It was vague, but it caught my attention. I'd sent it 3 nights earlier, a single sentence with no context. "I might need to ask you a question someday." Not yet. It was a risk, but it was time. We met 2 days later at a coffee shop halfway between where I was staying and his office. Neutral ground. Public. Loud enough that no one could overhear without trying. Daniel arrived early and chose a table near the window, his back to the wall. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, sharper around the edges. He didn't smile when he saw me, but he nodded like a man preparing to hear something unpleasant. "You look tired," he said. "I've had a rough few weeks," I replied. "We didn't order coffee right away." He waited. That told me he wasn't there to make small talk. I slid the envelope across the table. Not the original. A copy. I'd learned that lesson already. Daniel didn't touch it at first. He looked at me instead. Before I read this, he said, "You need to understand something. Once I do, I can't unknow it. I know I said. That's why I didn't come sooner." He picked up the pages and scanned them quickly, his eyes moving with practiced efficiency. I watched his face carefully, looking for shock or disbelief. There was none, just a tightening of his jaw. "This explains the urgency," he said quietly. "So I'm not imagining it," I said. "No," he replied. "You're not." Relief hit me harder than I expected, not because he confirmed my suspicions, but because he didn't question my sanity. He didn't ask what I'd done to provoke it. He didn't suggest reconciliation. He treated it like what it was. A problem. "This isn't complete," he said, tapping the pages. "But it's enough to tell me someone's been laying groundwork." "For how long?" I asked. Daniel hesitated. "Longer than you think." That was the moment everything shifted. Hearing it out loud from someone outside the family made it real in a way my own thoughts hadn't. This wasn't just betrayal. It was planning. "I don't want to confront him," I said quickly. "I don't want to blow this up." Daniel nodded. "Good. That would be a mistake. I studied him then, trying to decide if I'd made the right choice. He seemed calm, but there was something else there too. Caution. Not fear. Respect for the situation. You need to be careful, he said. If you're right about the direction this is going, exposure won't just embarrass him. It could ruin him. I'm not trying to ruin anyone, I said. I just want the truth to stop being used against me. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Truth has a way of doing its own damage, he said, whether you intend it or not. We talked for nearly an hour, not about revenge, not about justice, about timing, about restraint, about what not to do. He asked questions that felt invasive but necessary. Who had access to my information? Who spoke for whom? Who benefited from my silence? He didn't offer solutions. He offered boundaries. Don't sign anything, he said, not even something that looks harmless. I won't, I said. Don't accuse anyone yet, he added, and don't let them think you suspect more than you do. That last part made me pause. They already think I know something. They think you're emotional, he said, confused, hurt. Let them keep thinking that. When we stood to leave, he surprised me by placing his hand briefly on my arm. You did the right thing coming here, he said. But understand this. Once the truth surfaces, it won't stay contained. People will choose sides. I know, I said. Good, he replied. Then we're clear. We walked out separately. I sat in my car for a long time afterward, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. I felt lighter. Not because my problems were solved, but because I wasn't carrying them alone anymore. That feeling didn't last. That evening my phone rang, my father's number. I let it go to voicemail. You've been talking, his voice said, thin with irritation. I can feel it. I deleted the message without replying. The next day, Elaine showed up unannounced at my friend's place. I watched from the window as she stood on the porch, arms crossed, her posture rigid. I didn't open the door. She texted instead, We need to talk. This is getting serious. I waited an hour before responding. I'm resting. We'll talk later. There was no reply. Daniel called that night. They're nervous, he said. That means you're doing something right. I didn't say anything, I replied. You didn't have to, he said. Silence is louder than you think. I asked him then the question I'd been avoiding. What happens if this goes all the way? There was a pause. Then it stops being a family matter, he said, and starts being something else entirely. After we hung up, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house around me. My ribs still ached. My body still felt fragile. But my mind was clear. For years, my father had controlled every narrative in that family. He decided what was remembered, what was forgiven, what was buried. Anyone who challenged him was labeled ungrateful or unstable. He'd never expected resistance without noise. That was his blind spot. By the end of the week, the pressure had escalated. Missed calls, messages framed as concern, warnings disguised as advice, and beneath it all, a growing sense of urgency I could almost taste. They knew something was slipping. What they didn't know was that I wasn't rushing. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't plotting in the way they imagined. I was waiting. Because for the first time in my life, I understood the difference between being believed and being protected. Daniel hadn't promised to save me. He'd done something better. He'd told me when to stay quiet. And that knowledge shared between two people who understood the stakes was enough to change everything. The truth was no longer mine alone. And once that happens, there's no going back. Once I knew what to look for, it was everywhere. It started with small things. A bank notification I'd ignored months earlier because my father had told me it was a glitch. A statement that arrived late, then stopped arriving at all. A password reset notice I hadn't requested. At the time, I'd trusted him when he said he'd taken care of it. Now, every one of those moments came back with a different weight. Daniel told me not to dig recklessly. He was right. So I moved slowly, deliberately, like someone following a trail of footprints across fragile ground. I didn't break into accounts or demand records. I used what I already had access to, what had always been mine, but quietly rerouted while I wasn't paying attention. The first confirmation hit harder than the slap ever had. A benefit I'd earned years earlier had been redirected. Not stolen outright. Reassigned. The paperwork was clean, the language careful. It framed the change as temporary for my own good during a period of instability. The date on the authorization predated my hospital stay by weeks. They had planned this while smiling at me across the dinner table. I sat at my friend's kitchen counter with my laptop open, the house quiet around me, and felt something in my chest crack open. Not pain, clarity, the kind that leaves no room for denial. This wasn't about one bad decision. It was about a system. As I traced the timeline, the pattern sharpened. One account led to another. A contact name I didn't recognize appeared on more than one document. A mailing address that wasn't mine showed up repeatedly like a fingerprint. Every change was small enough to escape notice on its own. Together, they told a story of methodical control. I remembered my father insisting on handling things because I was too busy. I remembered Marlene saying it was easier if paperwork went through them. I remembered Elaine telling me I worried too much. They hadn't taken everything at once. They'd taken it gradually, quietly, while I was still inside the house, and convinced myself that was safety. The most devastating discovery wasn't financial. It was personal. There was a letter copied and saved in a file I had access to only because I'd never bothered to remove my name from a shared folder. It wasn't sent to me. It was about me. It described concerns about my reliability, my stress levels, my recent behavior. It was written in careful, sympathetic language, the kind designed to sound reasonable to anyone who didn't know me. The date made my hands shake. It had been drafted the week before my accident. I closed my eyes and let the memory of that week surface. The dinner where my father had watched me closely as I spoke. The way Elaine had interrupted me when I disagreed. The sudden concern over my sleep, my workload, my mood. They weren't worried. They were documenting. I pushed my chair back and stood pacing slowly, my ribs aching with each step. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were listening. I took a breath and forced myself to slow down. Panic would blur the edges. I needed the details sharp. By the time I sat back down, I understood something that made my stomach turn. My dependence hadn't been an accident. They'd discouraged me from setting things up independently, from reviewing statements, from attending meetings, from asking questions. Each time I deferred thinking it was temporary, thinking it was easier for them. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that exposing everything at once would be a mistake. The damage was too wide. Too many people were connected knowingly or not. If this blew up publicly, it wouldn't just hurt my father. It would pull others down with him, including people who had no idea how they'd been used. That mattered to me, even if it didn't matter to him. I called Daniel and told him what I'd found. I didn't send documents. I summarized carefully, watching my words. When I finished, there was a long pause on the line. "This confirms intent," he said finally, "and duration." "So it's not just me," I said. "No," he replied. "It's bigger than that." That was both a relief and a warning. "Don't act yet," he added, "but start thinking about leverage." Leverage. The word sat heavy in my mind after we hung up. I didn't like how it sounded. I didn't like what it implied, but I understood it. Justice without leverage was just noise. As the days passed, I stopped mourning what I'd lost. That phase ended abruptly, like a door slamming shut. Grief assumes innocence. This required something else. I focused on accountability. I began mapping out dependencies, what my father needed to keep things quiet, what assumptions he relied on, where his confidence came from. The more I observed, the clearer his blind spots became. He believed paperwork equaled protection. He believed authority figures wouldn't question him. And most of all, he believed I would never understand the full picture. That belief was his weakness. One afternoon, Elaine called unexpectedly. I answered, keeping my voice neutral. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm managing," I said. She hesitated. "Dad's been stressed. This whole situation is getting out of hand." For who, I asked. "For everyone," she said too quickly. There it was again. The same vague phrasing, the same avoidance. "I'm not trying to make trouble," I said. "I just want things to be fair." She sighed, relief bleeding into her voice. "Then maybe we can all move on." After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time, replaying her tone. She thought she'd reassured me. She thought I was backing down. That assumption was useful. The final piece came from an unexpected place. A routine check turned up a dependency my father hadn't considered. Something he needed finalized soon. Something that required clean records and unquestioned authority. A pressure point. I didn't celebrate when I found it. I didn't even smile. I wrote it down and closed the laptop. The trap wasn't about revenge. It was about timing. That night, lying awake, I thought about everything that had been taken from me without my knowledge. The years of quiet redirection, the erosion of autonomy disguised as care. The way my father had trained everyone around him to see control as concern. I also thought about the look on his face in the hospital the moment I said no. How quickly his composure had cracked. He believed everything was already secured, that the story had been written and filed away. He was wrong, because once you see the system, you can choose where to press. And I had finally found where it would hurt him the most. I turned off the light and let the darkness settle my breathing slow and steady. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't afraid. I was ready. And he had no idea that the power he thought he'd stolen from me was about to come back to him reshaped into something he couldn't control. I made sure they thought I'd given up. That part was important. I stopped asking questions altogether. I stopped pushing back, stopped delaying, stopped even sounding uncertain. When my father called, I answered on the second ring. When Elaine texted, I replied quickly. Short sentences, neutral tone, no edge. I told them I was tired. I told them I didn't want more conflict. I told them I needed time to think. They heard what they wanted to hear. The first step was choosing where the truth would surface. Not the house, not a family dinner, not anywhere my father's voice could fill the room and bend the outcome. I needed a place with rules, with records, with people who didn't care about our last name. Once I knew the battleground, everything else became preparation. I didn't rush. Rushing would have left marks. Instead, I organized what I already had. Dates, messages, voicemails, documents that contradicted each other just enough to raise questions. I built timelines the way Daniel had taught me, clean and simple, so anyone could follow them without my explanation. I kept copies in 3 places. Not because I was paranoid, but because I'd learned what happens when someone decides your access is inconvenient. There were moments I almost slipped. One afternoon, Elaine mentioned something she shouldn't have. A casual line about how my father just needed this one thing finalized before everything calmed down. I felt my pulse jump, felt the urge to ask what that thing was. I didn't. I nodded, made a sympathetic noise, and let her keep talking. She filled the silence for me, always did. That was when I understood how much people reveal when they believe you're no longer a threat. My father's blind spot wasn't cruelty. It was certainty. He believed control meant predictability. He believed that once someone stopped resisting, they were neutralized. So I let him believe it. I agreed to meet him briefly in public for coffee. I arrived early and chose a table where my back was to the door. He liked feeling dominant. I let him have it. "You look better," he said, sitting down without asking. "I'm recovering," I replied. He leaned forward. "We can put this behind us," he said, "if you cooperate." There it was. The same word dressed up as reconciliation. "I don't want problems." I said, "I just want things settled." His shoulders relaxed. He talked too much after that, about how complicated things had become, about how other people were impatient, about how he'd done everything to protect me. I listened. I nodded. I didn't contradict a single word. When we stood to leave, he put a hand on my arm, a gesture meant to reclaim authority. "You're doing the right thing," he said. I almost laughed. Instead, I said, "I hope so." After that, the pieces fell into place faster, not because I pushed them, but because he did. He started making calls in front of people, issuing instructions, acting like the outcome was inevitable. He didn't realize inevitability cuts both ways. There was a moment late one night when the plan almost collapsed. I received a message that suggested a document had gone missing, something critical. My heart rate spiked for the first time in days. I didn't react. I waited. 2 hours later, another message came through. False alarm, misplaced file. Everything was fine. That was when I knew how fragile his confidence really was. I thought often about telling someone else, about warning a relative who was being used without realizing it, about pulling Elaine aside and laying everything out, hoping she'd finally see the truth. But Daniel's words echoed in my head. Acting too soon destroys leverage. So I held my silence. I tested my resolve daily. When my father spoke about fairness. When Marlene used the word family like a shield. When Elaine sounded tired and afraid, caught between loyalty and conscience. I reminded myself why I was doing this. Not for revenge, for clarity, for an end that couldn't be rewritten later. The trap wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no secret recordings, no explosive reveal. It was procedural, boring even to anyone who didn't understand the stakes. And that was exactly why it worked. By the time my father realized something was wrong, it was too late to adjust. He'd committed to a version of events that couldn't withstand scrutiny. He'd signed where he shouldn't have signed. He'd spoken too freely to the wrong people. He thought I was watching from the sidelines. He didn't know I'd already stepped off the field. The night before everything shifted, I sat alone in my friend's living room, the lights off the city quiet outside the window. My ribs still ached when I moved too fast, but the pain felt distant, now manageable. I reviewed the timeline one last time, not to change anything, just to be certain. There was a strange calm in knowing I'd done all I could, that the outcome no longer depended on me convincing anyone of anything. Facts would do the work. I sent one final message that night, not to my father, not to Elaine, to Daniel. Tomorrow works. His reply came a minute later. Be ready. Once this starts, there's no pause button. I set the phone down and stared into the darkness. For years, my life had revolved around anticipating my father's reactions, his moods, his approval, his anger. Now, for the first time, he was the one reacting. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt something steadier, relief. Because the trap wasn't about watching him fall. It was about stepping out of a system designed to keep me small. About ending a story that had been written without my consent. Outside, a car passed its headlights briefly sweeping across the wall. Then the room was dark again. Everything was in place. The date was set. The process was moving. And the man who had slapped me to the floor in a hospital room, certain of his power, was walking straight toward a moment he could not control. He just didn't know it yet. And he wouldn't see it coming until the truth closed around him, quiet and final, with nowhere left to turn. The first sign wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no frantic phone calls in the middle of the night. It was a delay. My father was always early, to meetings, to appointments, to anything that made him feel important. He treated time like a weapon, something he could use to remind people who was in charge. So when he mentioned casually that something had been pushed back, I knew. It's nothing he said over the phone too quickly. Just a formality. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch long enough to make him uncomfortable. Bureaucracy, he added. You know how it is. I did know. I knew exactly how it was. Bureaucracy only slowed things down when someone had asked the wrong question. Over the next few days, the tension crept into everything he did. He called more often, but spoke less. When he did talk, he repeated himself, circling the same points, as if rehearsing lines that were starting to sound thin even to him. Marlene left a message that was meant to sound reassuring. Everything's under control, she said. We're just waiting on one thing. One thing. Elaine stopped pretending altogether. When she texted, her messages were clipped anxious. Are you okay? Have you talked to Dad? This is getting complicated. Complicated meant the story was no longer holding. I noticed the change in smaller ways, too. My father stopped correcting people when they spoke over him. He stopped issuing instructions and started asking questions. Not openly. Never that. But his tone shifted the certainty leaking out around the edges. One afternoon I ran into a neighbor while walking slowly down the block, my ribs still sore but healing. She mentioned offhandedly that my father had been on edge lately. He snapped at the mailman, she said, half amused. That's not like him. It was exactly like him, just not in public. That night my phone buzzed with a voicemail I didn't listen to right away. I let it sit there while I made dinner, while I ate slowly, while I cleaned up. When I finally pressed play, his voice sounded strained. I don't appreciate being blindsided, he said. If you've been talking to anyone now, would be a good time to be honest. There it was. Not an accusation. A probe. I deleted the message and didn't respond. The next consequence came from outside the family, and it rattled him more than anything else. I heard about it indirectly through Marlene, who couldn't help herself. "They're asking for clarification," she said on the phone, her voice tight. "It's probably nothing, but it's inconvenient." Inconvenient how I asked. She hesitated. "It just slows things down." That was the truth she kept tripping over. Speed mattered to them. Momentum. The illusion that everything was moving forward without resistance. And now it wasn't. I could almost picture my father at the table papers spread out jaw-clenched as he reread documents he'd skimmed too confidently the first time. I imagined him realizing that authority only worked when no one challenged it. The family began to fracture under the pressure. Elaine called late one night, her voice low. "Did you know about this?" she asked. "About what I said?" She sighed, frustrated. "Never mind." She hung up before I could say anything else. That told me everything I needed to know. She was scared, and fear makes people unpredictable. My father tried to reassert himself the only way he knew how. He called a family meeting. "I want us all on the same page," he said when we gathered in a public space he'd chosen somewhere he thought gave him the advantage. "There's been some confusion." Confusion. Another careful word. He spoke for 10 minutes straight, outlining his version of events, his voice growing louder as he went. He framed every decision as protection, every delay as sabotage, every question as an insult. When he finally paused, waiting for agreement, no one spoke. Marlene stared at her hands. Elaine shifted in her seat. A cousin checked his phone. For the first time, his authority met silence instead of compliance. He noticed. I saw it in the way his eyes flicked around the table, searching for an ally. He didn't look at me. Not once. He still believed the threat had come from somewhere else. After the meeting, he pulled me aside. "This isn't how I wanted things to go," he said, his voice low. "But we can still fix it." I met his gaze. "Fix what?" He studied my face, looking for something. Anger, fear, anything he could use. He found none. "You know what he said." I shook my head. "I don't." That was the moment he realized he was reacting, not directing. The moment the ground shifted beneath him. The pressure intensified after that. Requests became demands. Demands became threats, thinly disguised as concern. He tried reminding me of favors he'd done, sacrifices he'd made, the way he'd always looked out for me. It didn't work anymore. Another delay followed, then another, each one small on its own, but together they formed a pattern he couldn't ignore. His calls grew shorter, his temper sharper. He snapped at Marlene. He accused Elaine of not being careful enough. Blame had to land somewhere. I stayed invisible through all of it. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't offer opinions. I didn't defend myself against things no one said out loud. I let the pressure build naturally, the way steam builds in a sealed room. One evening, Daniel called. "They're scrambling," he said simply. "How bad?" I asked. "Bad enough that mistakes are being made," he replied. "Bad enough that the timeline they counted on is gone." I thanked him and hung up my hand steady. The final crack came when my father tried to force an outcome. He pushed too hard too fast, assuming authority would override process. It didn't. It only drew more attention. That was when the questions stopped being polite. That night I received a text from him that said only this: "We need to talk. Now." I didn't reply. I sat on the couch in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the house, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. My ribs ached faintly, a reminder of where this had all started. A hospital room, a slap, a demand he thought would put me back in my place. He'd been so certain then, so sure that fear would work the way it always had. Now certainty was gone, replaced by confusion, by urgency, by the dawning realization that control only exists as long as no one questions it. And the most dangerous thing for a man like my father wasn't opposition. It was exposure. As I set my phone face down on the table, I knew the hardest part was coming. Not the fallout, not the consequences, but the moment when he would finally understand that the power he thought he'd cracked open in that hospital room was never his to command. It was slipping through his fingers now, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The room was quiet, in the way places get when no one wants to make the first mistake. Neutral walls, A long table, chairs arranged carefully as if order alone could keep things civil. I arrived early and took a seat near the end, my back straight, my hands folded loosely in front of me. I felt calm in a way that surprised me. Not numb, not detached, just ready. When my father walked in, he looked confident at first. He always did. His shoulders were squared, his steps deliberate, his expression practiced into something that passed for authority. He greeted a few people by name, shook hands, smiled like this was just another formality he would breeze through. He didn't look at me. That was his mistake. The meeting began with routine remarks. Dates were confirmed, names were read aloud, papers were passed down the table. Everything moved according to procedure, slow and precise, leaving no room for grandstanding. My father shifted in his chair. He leaned forward, interlacing his fingers, ready to take over when the moment came. I could feel it, that familiar urge of his to control the narrative, to steer the conversation back to safe ground. Then the first question landed. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't accusatory, it was simply unexpected. There was a pause, just long enough. My father smiled and answered smoothly the way he always had. His voice was steady, confident. He spoke as if he'd rehearsed the explanation a dozen times. The next question followed immediately. This one required documentation. Papers were requested. Not from me, from him. I watched the change happen in real time. The tightening of his jaw, the flicker of irritation that crossed his face before he masked it. He handed over the folder he'd brought, his movements precise, controlled. The person across from him skimmed the pages, then looked up. "These dates don't align," she said calmly. The room shifted. My father leaned back slightly. "They should," he replied. "There may be a clerical error." No one argued, no one raised their voice. They simply turned another page. Another document was introduced, then another. Each one laid out carefully, each one narrowing the space he had to maneuver. His answers grew longer, more detailed, more defensive. I stayed quiet. At one point, he glanced toward me, his eyes sharp, searching my face for something. Anger, fear, satisfaction. I gave him none of it. I met his gaze briefly, then looked back down at the table. The unraveling didn't happen all at once. It happened in stages. First, denial. He dismissed the inconsistencies as misunderstandings, as technicalities no one needed to worry about. Then, rationalization. He framed his decisions as protective, necessary, made under pressure for the greater good. When that didn't work, his voice sharpened. He accused the process itself of being flawed. He questioned motives. He tried to reassert dominance by sheer force of personality. It fell flat. Facts don't respond to intimidation. Someone asked about a communication that had never been disclosed. Someone else referenced a decision made without proper authorization. Each time his answers came a fraction of a second slower. The man who had slapped me in a hospital room because he couldn't stand being told no was now trapped by his own certainty. He had assumed his authority would go unquestioned. He had assumed my silence meant ignorance. He was wrong on both counts. I was asked to speak once. Just once. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I stated a single timeline correction, quietly, clearly, and then stopped. I let the documents do the rest. That was the moment everything changed. My father's face drained of color, not dramatically, subtly, like a light being dimmed rather than switched off. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time, he had nothing prepared. A decision was made shortly after, not shouted, not announced with ceremony, just stated, recorded, and set in motion. There would be consequences. As the meeting concluded, chairs scraped softly against the floor. Papers were gathered. People stood and spoke in low voices, already moving on to whatever came next. The world, indifferent as ever, continued. My father remained seated. I stood slowly, my ribs reminding me of their presence, but the pain felt distant now, manageable, temporary. He finally looked up at me then, not with anger, with something closer to disbelief. "You did this," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No," I replied. "You did." He searched my face again, as if trying to find the child he'd controlled for so long, the one who argued, the one who reacted, the one who could be dismissed. He didn't find him. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. There was nothing left to hear. I turned and walked toward the door, each step steady, deliberate. Behind me, I heard his chair move. I didn't turn around. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. Not because something good had happened, but because something heavy had finally been set down. I sat on a bench across the street and let myself breathe. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relieved, the kind of relief that comes when a long, exhausting truth no longer has to be carried alone. My phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "It's done. We'll talk soon." I replied with a simple thank you. As I put the phone away, I thought back to the hospital room, to the smell of antiseptic, to the sound of my body hitting the floor, to the certainty on my father's face as he towered over me, convinced fear would restore his control. He had never imagined a reckoning like this. No shouting, no public humiliation, no dramatic confrontation he could twist into a story of persecution. Just process, just truth, just the quiet, irreversible collapse of a system built on silence and assumption. I stood up and started walking not toward home, not toward any familiar place, but forward, away from the version of myself that had spent decades trying to earn fairness from someone who didn't believe in it. Behind me, somewhere in that building, my father was learning what it felt like to be powerless without an audience to intimidate. I didn't need to see it. I'd already seen enough. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, not easy, just quiet in the way things get after a storm is past and everyone is counting what's left standing. I woke up each morning on my friend's couch, the ache in my ribs slowly fading, the weight in my chest lighter than it had been in years. My father didn't call. That alone told me everything I needed to know. The house stayed closed to me. No apologies arrived, no explanations. But the pressure was gone. The frantic urgency that had driven everything from the hospital slap to the locked door had evaporated overnight. Whatever he'd been racing toward had come to a stop. People don't like to talk about what happens after the truth comes out. They imagine some dramatic reckoning, a final argument, a tearful confession. Real life doesn't work that way. Real life rearranges itself quietly. I heard updates through other people, short comments, careful phrasing. My father was dealing with some matters. He was keeping to himself. He was not himself lately. The same people who once excused everything he did now spoke about him with caution, like they were relearning the rules. Elaine called once. Her voice was small, uncertain. "I didn't know it was like that," she said. I believed her. And I didn't. "It's done now," I replied. She hesitated, then asked, "Can we talk sometime?" Maybe, I said, and I meant it. Maybe. Not now. Not until talking no longer felt like another obligation. Marlene didn't reach out at all. That was fine too. I spent my days rebuilding in small, unglamorous ways, updating accounts, reclaiming access, sitting across from professionals who spoke to me directly instead of over my head. No one rushed me. No one told me to calm down or stop asking questions. I realized how abnormal my old normal had been. One afternoon, as I was walking slowly through the park near my friend's place, the sun warm on my face, I caught my reflection in the dark glass of a parked car. I looked thinner, older, tired, but I also looked steady. For most of my life, I had confused endurance with strength. I thought surviving meant staying quiet, staying useful, staying agreeable. I thought dignity was something you earned by sacrificing yourself enough times. I was wrong. Dignity isn't granted. It's claimed. The memory of the hospital room came back to me often. Not the pain, but the clarity. The moment I said no. The moment everything shifted. At the time, I'd thought the slap was the worst thing that could happen. It turned out it was the moment that saved me. Daniel and I met one last time just to close the loop. He slid a thin folder across the table and nodded. "This is as far as it goes," he said. "From here, it's maintenance, not battle." I thanked him not just for his help, but for his restraint. He'd never tried to steer my anger. He'd simply made sure the truth could stand on its own. When I left his office, I didn't feel like a victor. I felt finished. That night, I packed my duffel bag again. Not because I was being forced out this time, but because I was ready to move forward. I found a small apartment not far from where I'd been staying. Nothing fancy, just clean, quiet, mine. The first night there, I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a place that didn't carry anyone else's expectations. I breathed slowly, deliberately, the way I'd learned to after the injury. I wasn't waiting for the phone to ring. I wasn't bracing for the next demand. I was just there. People ask me now if I regret how things ended, if I wish I'd handled it differently, if I feel guilty. The truth is simpler than that. I regret the years I spent trying to earn fairness from someone who believed control was love. I regret the silence that taught others they could speak for me. I don't regret the moment I stopped playing my part. Walking away didn't make me cruel. It made me honest. And honesty has a way of clarifying who belongs in your life and who only benefited from your compliance. I still carry scars. Some you can see if you look closely, others you can't. But they don't weigh me down the way they used to. They remind me of what happens when you finally choose yourself without asking permission. If you're listening to this and something about it feels familiar, if you've ever been told to stay quiet for the sake of peace, to accept mistreatment, to keep the family together, know this. You're not weak for noticing the pattern. You're not wrong for wanting your dignity back, and you're not alone. If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear from you. You can share your thoughts or your own experience in the comments. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is let someone else know they're seen. And if you want to stay with me for more stories like this, stories about justice, boundaries, and finding your way back to yourself, consider staying here. Subscribe, come back, and take a breath with me. We're walking forward now, with our dignity intact.